Now, bus passengers in the west of Scotland are likely to see major changes to the way local services are run under radical plans just agreed. The Regional Transport Authority, SPT, has approved a return to locally regulated buses for the first time in decades. But there's concern about the cost of introducing such a service and how long it would take. Our transport correspondent, David Henderson, is with me. So, David, the aim of all of this, I'm sure, is to improve the bus network. So what sort of changes might we see?
Well, big changes, Hayley, and fundamentally we're looking at plans which have just been approved to unpick the way bus services have been run for almost 40 years, an end to what is generally known as the deregulated bus network, introduced by Margaret Thatcher back in the mid-1980s, a system which allows private companies to operate anywhere they want. The idea at the time when that plan was introduced was that competition between operators would improve things for passengers, would lower fares, deliver more competition, more choice for the travelling public, more services. That was the idea back in the 80s when it was introduced, but many critics have said that, in fact, as the system has been introduced, exactly the opposite has happened. And just across the west of Scotland, in the area we're talking about, controlled by SPT, the Regional Transport Authority, they complain that over recent years, fares are up, services are down, there are fewer buses, and the network has been hollowed out. So they complain that really the system is not working for the travelling public, and it's partly because a lack of financial support, lack of subsidy, partly, many think, also because companies in a deregulated market can simply choose to serve those profitable routes that they want to and not put on buses on the quieter routes where they can't make much of a profit. So across much of Scotland, including the west of Scotland, there has been a general concern about a hollowing out of Scotland's bus networks. The plan is to change that. Now, before this decision was made, there was a protest outside SPT's headquarters calling for change by people who argue the system just doesn't work for them.
It's not uncommon for buses not to show up because there are timetable services. It's not uncommon to have not enough buses running on the same routes, and in my personal experiences, where I live is relatively, there's only 2 buses that go through that area, that you could be waiting, if one doesn't show up, an extra hour on certain days, and that can throw any plans or tasks that you had out the window that day. You could sometimes be expected to leave the house an hour or 2 earlier just to make it somewhere on time.
They were reliable for a time, but they've got worse and worse, and there are some buses that just don't turn up at all. It's kind of difficult to know when buses are coming unless you're able to go onto a phone, a magic phone, and it tells you when the next bus is due. But a lot of elderly people are not able to do that, so they still walk to the bus stop and look and see what time the bus is coming in, and then it doesn't come.
So, David, how is it all going to work in practice?
Well, instead of the current system, the deregulated system, what SPT want is that services broadly are brought back under more local control, where local leaders can set bus fares, they can set routes, they can set timetables, and it also means that once this network is put in place, private bus firms have to bid for contracts in a planned network. Now, they've got the powers from the Scottish Government to operate like this. Bus firms, it will be paid to run services where they're told to run them, not where they choose. It's a system called the franchise system. It's been in place in London for many years. It's now being rolled out in Greater Manchester. I've just been down there finding out how it works. It's called the B Network. I've been hearing from the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Labour's Andy Burnham, who's been the prime mover behind this new network.
The mantra that the market solves everything was what people were sold. Well, you know what? It doesn't. And it certainly doesn't sort out public transport. So getting your hands back on the system, making services accountable to people. So here's a really important thing. You know, at a bus stop in Manchester, still now, because we've not completed it, but it's true in Glasgow or other Scottish cities, if the bus sails right past or doesn't turn up at all, there's nothing you can do, nothing to be able to get comeback against those operators and hold them to account for the travelling public. That's what deregulation means. But now there is something I can do. They may suffer financial penalties if they don't turn up on time. And that's a world of difference. But the other big one is the fare box. That fare box comes back to us now. If more people use the bus, we take the upside of that, and we use that upside to keep the fares low. And then because the fares are going lower, even more people might use it. And you create a sort of a, if you like, a virtuous circle rather than the spiral of decline that we've had in this city for 4 decades prior to the B network. So I would just say to colleagues in Scotland, I mean, particularly in Glasgow, people have to make their own decisions. But the evidence from Greater Manchester is clear. Putting buses back under public control, improve services, it makes you able to recycle the proceeds into keeping fares low, and critically, it makes the people the bosses of the buses.
OK, David, so that outlines the sort of situation in Manchester, similar here. So are there any potential obstacles then to these plans?
Yeah, 2 major pitfalls. Time and money. When it comes to time, it will take time to put a new system in place. SPT themselves say it could take between 5 and 7 years to put a Manchester-style franchise system in place. For campaigners, they just don't think that's good enough. They want it done more quickly. SPT have proposals to fill in the gaps until this new system is in place to halt the decline using what are called bus service improvement partnerships, which mean contracts being put in place so transport authorities have contracts with bus companies to run services so those operators can be judged on performance. The second problem I mentioned is money. If you want to extend services, you have to find a way to pay for them. And SPT themselves warn that it will cost between 45 and 85 million pounds a year in extra funding to deliver a regional franchise. Now, long term, of course, supporters of this system say that if you have more passengers, because the buses are better, you get more funds, and so you get more services, and so you get more passengers, and so on. So there's a sort of, as Andy Burnham described, a virtuous cycle, so that more people are taking the bus and there's more money coming back from passengers.
But might they not need some of that money up front?
Well, that's going to be a key question, and the bus companies, some of them are concerned about this. McGill's have flagged up their concerns. They warn that bus franchising, they say, could create a £100 million annual black hole for Scottish taxpayers. So clearly, good funding is going to be absolutely crucial to make this work.
David, thanks for that. Our transport correspondent, David Henderson. And listening to that is Ellie Harrison of Get Glasgow Moving. Hi there, Ellie.
Hi.
So what do you make of these proposals then? Do you think it will be good for Glasgow's public transport?
Absolutely. This is a huge step in the right direction today. And just to say, sorry if the line's a bit noisy, I'm actually stood outside SPT's offices on St Vincent Street at the moment. We've just been in watching the board meeting this morning and seeing this landmark decision from SPT to move ahead with using these new powers to bring the bus network back into public control. So it's noisy here, but it is a very exciting day. This is a massive step in the right direction. And it's the first time that we've heard SPT say that they are actually going to use these new powers that are available to them.
So what do you think the main problems are for bus transport at the moment? What are your big issues?
Well, I think David Henderson set it all out very clearly, and SPT themselves have acknowledged that the bus network that we have at the moment is so much smaller than it was in 1986 when the buses were deregulated. And the incentive for private bus companies is to cut routes and to hike the fares up on the remaining routes so they can maximise their profits. And as Andy Burnham said, there's been a cycle of decline, not just in Greater Manchester, but in all parts of England, Scotland and Wales where bus deregulation was implemented. And, you know, in Glasgow, we've seen crisis after crisis on our buses, particularly the night bus crisis last summer. when first said that they were going to pull out of running all-night buses in the city. And we've seen a huge waves of cuts over the last few years. Buses are really expensive in Glasgow. It's £2.85 for a single on first. If you compare that to Edinburgh, where buses are run by the publicly owned Lothian buses, it's only £2 for a single. So we need to regulate the bus network so that we can get rid of those inequalities and ensure that everybody has a decent bus service to get them where they need to go.
But if passengers, if this did make it cheaper for people to get on the bus in the west of Scotland, that might mean having to pay for what are sort of loss-making routes. So who do you think would pick up the cost of that? Do you have concerns about, where the funding comes from? Would taxpayers not end up paying anyway for it?
Well, we're paying anyway. More than 55% of private bus companies' income comes from public subsidy at the moment. So it's a huge public investment anyway. And under a deregulated system, what SPT has to do at the moment is to run so-called socially necessary routes to try and fill in the gaps, running services that aren't commercially viable. So under deregulation, what you have is the private bus companies sucking all the profits off the commercial routes. Meanwhile, SPT's got a tiny budget trying to fill in the gaps. So that's a really inefficient use of public money at the moment.
Okay.
And franchising, as Andy Burnham said, will help to even that out and ensure that profits stay in the system to run the less profitable routes or the socially necessary routes.
OK, well, we shall see how it all pans out, I'm sure. Ellie Harrison, thanks very much for joining me. Ellie is from the Get Glasgow Moving campaign.